In the 13th century, one name froze entire civilizations. That name was the Mongols. When Mongol armies began moving toward a region, panic spread faster than their horses. Cities did not prepare for negotiation or diplomacy. They prepared for annihilation and mass destruction. From northern China to the vast lands of Central Asia, the outcome remained terrifyingly predictable. The Mongols advanced with speed and ruthless precision. Armies assembled to resist them were shattered without mercy. Kings who attempted defiance were publicly executed as warnings. Entire populations were slaughtered to establish psychological dominance. This was not ordinary conquest or political expansion. This was strategic terror executed with disciplined efficiency. The Mongol Empire did not merely defeat its enemies in battle. It destroyed their confidence before the first arrow was released. Stories of massacres traveled far beyond the battlefield itself. Those stories weakened resistance long before Mongol cavalry appeared. Many cities surrendered without raising a single defensive banner because fighting the Mongols was not considered courageous. It was considered suicidal and strategically foolish. They had already crushed the Khwarezmian Empire with shocking speed. They had burned Baghdad in 1258, ending centuries of political dominance. They had defeated armies that were larger and wealthier. They had dismantled states that seemed permanently established. Their mobility was unmatched across open-steppe terrain. Their mounted archers executed coordinated attacks with deadly discipline. Their military campaigns were designed for rapid psychological collapse. So when Mongol forces began looking toward India, expectations were clear. Delhi would eventually fall under Mongol pressure. It seemed like a matter of time rather than possibility. India was wealthy, densely populated, and strategically valuable. Its cities contained enormous economic and symbolic importance. For an expanding empire, this region represented opportunity. By the late 13th century, Mongol incursions had already tested India's northern defenses. These were not random raids without purpose. They were calculated probes searching for weakness. Then in 1299, a serious Mongol force advanced toward Delhi. The commander leading them was Kutlu Khwaja. Confidence was not questioned within Mongol ranks. Their empire had not been decisively stopped before. However, history presents a question that deserves careful examination. If the Mongols were truly unstoppable, why did India remain unconquered? Why does the southern boundary of their empire stop where it does? Why was Delhi never reduced to ashes like Baghdad? Outside the capital of the Delhi Sultanate, at a place called Kili, something changed. There was no dramatic destruction of Mongol forces. There was no cinematic annihilation of their cavalry. Instead, something quieter but more significant occurred. The Mongols were denied decisive momentum. For an empire built on inevitability, momentum was everything. Their strategy depended on speed and psychological shock. They required opponents to panic and fragment under pressure. They needed rulers to retreat behind walls and fear. But Delhi's ruler did not respond as expected. The man governing the Sultanate was Alauddin Khalji. He refused to wait passively behind fortified defenses. He chose confrontation over hesitation. He marched outward to meet the Mongol army directly. That decision alone disrupted Mongol psychological dominance. The confrontation that followed became known as the Battle of Kili. This was not merely a battlefield encounter. It was a test of imperial limits, because every expanding empire eventually encounters resistance that holds. At Kili, the Mongol myth of inevitability faced structured opposition. They were not destroyed in catastrophic defeat, but they were stopped from achieving decisive victory. And once inevitability begins to crack, expansion slows. Tonight, we examine why the Mongols failed to conquer India, and how one confrontation outside Delhi reshaped imperial ambition. If you want history without the sugarcoating, if you want to understand how power really works, then subscribe to Forgotten Empires. Because the biggest battles in history were never fought on battlefields. To understand why the Mongols failed in India, we must first understand why they rarely failed anywhere else. The Mongol army was not a random tribal force. It was a highly disciplined military system. Every soldier was trained from childhood. Horse riding was not a skill. It was a way of life. Archery was not practice. It was survival training. Each Mongol warrior carried multiple bows. Each warrior rode several horses during campaigns. This allowed them to travel extraordinary distances daily. Traditional armies could not match their speed. Where others marched slowly with supply lines, the Mongols moved like a storm. They lived off livestock and captured resources. They required minimal logistical support. Their mobility created strategic unpredictability. But speed alone does not build empires. The real Mongol weapon was coordination. Their army was divided into decimal units: 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 formations. Each unit obeyed strict command discipline. Orders were followed without hesitation or debate. This structure allowed complex battlefield maneuvers. Feigned retreats became devastating traps. Enemies chased what appeared to be fleeing soldiers. Then Mongol cavalry surrounded them completely. Arrows rained from every direction simultaneously. Armies collapsed in confusion and terror. But perhaps their most powerful weapon was psychological warfare. Before Mongol forces even arrived at city gates, rumors of massacres spread across regions. Stories described entire populations exterminated. Cities were burned to establish reputational fear. Resistance became irrational in the minds of defenders. Many rulers surrendered without open confrontation. The Mongols understood something fundamental about power. Fear multiplies faster than military strength. When Baghdad fell in 1258, it sent shockwaves across the Islamic world. The symbolic heart of centuries of authority collapsed. After that moment, Mongol reputation intensified dramatically. They were no longer invaders. They were inevitability personified, and inevitability removes courage from opponents. By the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched across Eurasia, from East Asia to the Middle East. Vast territories submitted under their dominance. India stood to the south of their expansion. Wealthy, structured, and economically significant, for Mongol commanders, India represented opportunity. Yet India also presented unfamiliar challenges. Unlike Central Asia, northern India was not open-stepped. It contained rivers, agricultural lands, dense settlements. The terrain reduced free cavalry maneuvering. Climate conditions differed drastically from Mongol homelands. Heat and monsoon cycles complicated prolonged campaigns. Still, Mongol leadership believed resistance would collapse quickly. They had defeated stronger powers before. They had shattered better-equipped armies repeatedly. Confidence shaped their strategic expectations. In 1299, a major Mongol force advanced again. The commander leading them was Kutlu Khwaja. Their objective was clear and aggressive. They intended to pressure Delhi directly. If Delhi fell, northern India would fragment. If northern India fragmented, conquest would accelerate. The Mongols relied on decisive victories. They needed shock to produce collapse. They needed one overwhelming battlefield success. That success would spread fear across the region. But this time, something disrupted the formula. The Sultan ruling Delhi refused passive defense. Instead of waiting for siege, he marched outward to confront the threat. This decision changed the psychological equation. Because the Mongols thrived when enemies hesitated. They thrived when rulers hid behind fortifications. They thrived when fear dictated strategy. At Kili, that expectation would be challenged, and when an empire's formula is disrupted, even slightly, consequences follow. The Mongols arrived expecting collapse. They did not expect disciplined confrontation. They did not expect resistance without panic. And that difference would matter more than numbers. Because the Battle of Kili would not test strength alone. It would test control. It would test patience. It would test whether Mongol inevitability could survive resistance. And in that test, the outcome would not follow familiar patterns. Empires are tested not by enemies alone. They are tested by leadership under pressure. When news arrived that Mongol forces were advancing, Delhi did not celebrate confidence. It felt fear. Merchants feared looting and destruction. Citizens feared massacre and displacement. Military commanders feared total annihilation. The Mongols had already destroyed greater powers. Why would Delhi be different? The ruler of the Delhi Sultanate at that time was Alauddin Khalji. He was not an inexperienced ceremonial monarch. He was ambitious, calculating, and deeply pragmatic. He understood something most rulers realized too late. External invasion exposes internal weakness immediately. If Delhi fractured psychologically, the Mongols would not need prolonged siege. Fear would accomplish their objective faster. Many rulers in similar situations retreated behind city walls. They waited defensively for inevitable confrontation. That approach usually favored Mongol tactics. Siege followed by psychological pressure often broke resistance. But Khalji made a radically different decision. He chose not to wait inside Delhi. He marched outward, toward the Mongol army. That decision was not reckless bravery. It was strategic calculation, because if Delhi appeared defensive, fear would spread uncontrollably across the region. If Delhi appeared bold and organized, confidence could stabilize the population. Psychology was as important as swords. Khalji understood Mongol warfare patterns clearly. He knew about their feigned retreats. He knew about their encirclement tactics. He knew about their reliance on enemy disorder. So he emphasized one instruction repeatedly. Maintain formation under all circumstances. Do not pursue impulsively. Do not break ranks emotionally. Discipline would be survival. The chosen battlefield lay near a location called Kili. Open ground offered risk for both sides. Mongol cavalry preferred maneuvering space. Delhi's forces needed structural cohesion. As the armies positioned themselves, tension rose visibly across the field. Mongol forces expected familiar patterns. Initial engagement, enemy fragmentation, decisive encirclement. But the opening stages unfolded differently. Delhi's formations did not collapse immediately. They absorbed pressure methodically. Arrows darkened the sky above the field. Dust clouds reduced visibility and communication. The battlefield grew chaotic quickly. Then came the most dangerous moment. One of Khalji's commanders, driven by aggression, launched an unauthorized forward charge. This reckless pursuit threatened strategic stability. It played directly into Mongol expectations. Mongol cavalry counterattacked with precision. They attempted to isolate and destroy the advancing unit. For several critical minutes, Delhi's entire battle line risked fragmentation. This was the point where many rulers panicked historically. This was the moment where collapse often began. But Khalji did not lose control. He refused emotional reaction. He reinforced discipline across his lines. He prevented total disintegration of formation. He denied the Mongols the chaos they required. Instead of widespread collapse, Delhi's forces stabilized gradually. The Mongols pushed hard, seeking decisive breakthrough, but decisive breakthrough never fully materialized. The Delhi army held its structural integrity. That alone disrupted Mongol rhythm because Mongol success depended on speed and certainty. At Kili, certainty began to weaken. The Mongols were not annihilated. They were not crushed dramatically, but they were denied the quick, decisive victory their system depended upon. And when inevitability meets resistance without panic, momentum begins to slow. The confrontation at Kili was not cinematic destruction, it was strategic denial. And sometimes denial is more damaging than defeat. Because defeat can be avenged. But stalled momentum creates doubt, and doubt spreads quietly within expanding empires. The Mongols came expecting psychological collapse. Instead, they encountered calculated restraint. That difference would shape what followed. The Battle of Kili did not destroy the Mongols, it did something more subtle and dangerous. It exposed limits within their expansion model. To understand this fully, we must look beyond a single battlefield. Empires expand successfully under certain conditions. Remove those conditions, and momentum slows. The Mongol war machine thrived on open terrain. Central Asia provided vast uninterrupted steppe. Cavalry could maneuver freely across enormous distances. Encirclement tactics required physical space. Speed required unobstructed geography. Northern India was not identical terrain. It contained rivers, cultivated lands, settlements, fortifications. Movement became more constrained and complicated. Large cavalry maneuvers required adaptation. Adaptation slows operational rhythm. The Mongols were masters of mobility. But mobility depends heavily on environment. Second, climate created sustained logistical pressure. The Mongol homeland climate differed dramatically. Indian heat exhausted men and horses quickly. Monsoon patterns disrupted prolonged campaigns. Seasonal unpredictability affected supply stability. Short raids were manageable under these conditions. Long-term occupation required different preparation. That preparation demanded additional resources and planning. Third, India possessed defensive depth. Many Central Asian states collapsed after capital loss. Political systems fragmented under Mongol shock. The Delhi Sultanate functioned differently. It maintained administrative continuity. It controlled multiple fortified urban centers. Even if one region suffered, others could sustain resistance. This distributed strength reduced psychological collapse. Fourth, leadership response remained consistent. After the Battle of Kili, Alauddin Khalji did not assume safety. He did not celebrate temporary relief. He treated the Mongol threat as ongoing reality. Military expansion followed immediately after Kili. Troop numbers increased significantly. Frontier defenses were strengthened strategically. Intelligence systems were improved systematically. Supply structures were reinforced carefully. This response prevented future shock-based collapse. The Mongols invaded India multiple times afterward, but each invasion required effort and planning. Each campaign faced prepared resistance. Prepared resistance reduces quick, decisive outcomes. The Mongol system depended on quick, decisive outcomes. Their empire expanded rapidly because victories were overwhelming. Overwhelming victories created reputational fear. Reputational fear accelerated future conquests. India disrupted that acceleration cycle. The Mongols did not achieve dramatic triumph. Without dramatic triumph, fear weakens gradually. Without fear, surrender becomes less automatic. The cost-benefit equation begins shifting. Empires are pragmatic structures. They expand where reward outweighs cost. If conquest becomes resource-intensive, strategic focus changes direction. India required sustained military pressure. It required climate adaptation. It required facing organized defensive reform. For Mongol leadership, other regions presented easier expansion. Easier expansion produced faster territorial gain. Faster territorial gain strengthened imperial legitimacy. Thus, India became strategically less attractive, not because it was unconquerable in theory, but because it was not efficiently conquerable. Efficiency drives imperial decision. Kili demonstrated that India would not collapse quickly. Repeated invasions confirmed structural resistance. The southern boundary of Mongol dominance stabilized gradually. Expansion slowed, not through catastrophic defeat. Expansion slowed through resistance that held. History often remembers explosive empire collapses. It forgets moments where expansion simply stops. Kili was not the end of Mongol power. It was the beginning of imperial limitation, and limitation, once recognized, changes ambition, because when inevitability weakens, strategy recalculates accordingly. India did not destroy the Mongol Empire, but it forced the empire to reconsider southern expansion, and that reconsideration shaped Eurasian history quietly. The Mongols did not collapse at Kili. Let us be clear about that reality. They remained one of the strongest empires on earth. They still controlled enormous territories across Eurasia. They still commanded, disciplined and feared cavalry forces. But something important changed in 1299. The myth of unstoppable expansion weakened slightly, and empires rely heavily on myth. The Mongol Empire expanded not only through strength, it expanded through psychological inevitability. Opponents believed resistance was pointless. That belief accelerated surrender dramatically, but India did not surrender automatically. The Delhi Sultanate did not fragment instantly. Its ruler, Alauddin Khalji, did not allow fear to dictate policy. He responded with structure instead of panic. He responded with discipline instead of impulse. The Battle of Kili did not deliver cinematic annihilation. It delivered strategic denial. The Mongols expected quick, decisive victory. They expected psychological collapse after confrontation. They did not receive either outcome. Instead, they encountered organized resistance. They encountered a state willing to reform militarily. They encountered geography and climate complicating campaigns. They encountered cost without guaranteed reward. And empires are ultimately pragmatic entities. When expansion becomes inefficient, ambition shifts direction quietly. The Mongols could have continued pushing south aggressively, but every campaign into India required resources. Every campaign required adaptation and planning. Other regions offered faster and easier victories. Easier victories reinforced imperial authority more effectively. Thus, India became the southern limit of Mongol dominance, not through dramatic, heroic destruction, but through sustained refusal to collapse. This distinction matters deeply. History often glorifies explosive final battles. It celebrates moments of dramatic annihilation. Yet empires frequently weaken in quieter ways. They encounter resistance that simply holds. They encounter environments that reduce efficiency. They encounter rulers who refuse psychological surrender. Over time, expansion slows. Momentum decreases gradually. Inevitability transforms into calculation, and calculation introduces caution. The Mongols reshaped global history undeniably. They connected east and west through vast territories. They facilitated trade routes across Eurasia. They altered political structures permanently. But even the most powerful empire meets boundaries. Even the fastest cavalry cannot outrun structural resistance forever. India did not destroy the Mongol Empire. India imposed limits on its southern ambition, and limits are powerful historical forces. Because once an empire discovers its limits, it must reconsider its future path. Kili represents more than a battlefield encounter. It represents the moment inevitability met discipline. It represents the moment fear met calculation. It represents the moment expansion encountered structure. The Mongols arrived in India expecting repetition. They expected another city to vanish. Instead, they found a state unwilling to panic. They found a ruler unwilling to retreat psychologically. They found resistance organized enough to endure. And endurance changes imperial momentum. That is why the Mongols failed to conquer India. Not because they lacked power, but because power without inevitability slows. Outside Delhi in 1299, the storm did not destroy everything. It met a wall that refused to break. And sometimes in history, refusal is stronger than conquest.